LinkedIn presents.
I'm Rufus Griscum, and this is The Next Big Idea. Today, the risks and rapture of superintelligence. Today's episode is a doozy. I won't sugarcoat it. Our guest today thinks there is a 70% probability that AI will achieve superintelligence, resulting in either human subjugation or extermination. The end of our story. And he thinks this could happen in the next 10 years. Now, of course, there are many people who disagree. We'll get into that. Some think AI will never achieve superintelligence. Others think it will take many decades, and that time will enable us to build in the transparency to keep AIs aligned. That's a word you'll hear many times in this conversation, meaning working in collaboration with humans to advance our interests. But our guest today, Daniel Kokotajlo, is worth taking seriously because he has an uncanny track record of accurately predicting AI progress. In 2021, he published a scenario titled What 2026 Looks Like, in which he laid out predictions for the next 5 years of AI progress. From the surge of advanced chatbots to U.S. restrictions on the export of AI chips to China, many of Daniel's predictions have come true, earning him a reputation as a reluctant prophet. After that success, he joined OpenAI as a governance researcher, only to depart in 2024 in a very public break over AI safety concerns. Now free to speak his mind, Daniel has teamed up with other top analysts to produce AI 2027, a detailed forecast published a few weeks ago that provides a month-by-month roadmap of how the next waves of AI development might unfold. That's what we're going to talk about today. But first, I think it's worth taking a moment to step back and think through what we're doing right now with AI. We are building a new form of intelligence, an engineered mind modeled on our own, but developing at a dramatically accelerated pace. The parallels with the evolution of the human brain are remarkable, but they shouldn't surprise us because the first neural networks, the foundational architecture of modern AI, were quite literally modeled on the human brain. Frank Rosenblatt, who built the first neural network, the perceptron, in 1958, was an experimental psychologist who set out to build a machine that could help us understand and replicate human intelligence. It was teeny by today's standards and could only do simple things like distinguish a circle from a square. But the basic architecture, with dramatically more scale, proved to be able to do extraordinary things. The evolution of the human brain over millions of years followed a similar path. I was interested to learn that our brains are built out of the same stuff as all other creatures, ants, chipmunks, dolphins. We all use the same neurons connected by glia that communicate using the same chemical neurotransmitters. Ants have 250,000 neurons. Chipmunks have about 70 million. Dolphins, about 13 billion. We humans, meanwhile, have 86 billion neurons. Across the animal kingdom, it is largely true that more neurons results in more intelligence. But there are exceptions. Elephants and whales, for instance, have larger brains than humans, 4 times larger in the case of sperm whales. So why aren't they giving TED Talks? Different architecture. Elephant and whale brains have developed unique sensory specializations applied to their larger bodies, such as echolocation circuitry in the case of whales. Human brains, meanwhile, have specialized circuitry for language, long-horizon planning, social modeling, and theory of mind. Those refinements, not just neuron count, turned grunts into Shakespeare. So size matters, but so does architecture. In our development of AI in recent decades, we have mirrored with unnerving accuracy the evolution of animal cognition over billions of years. We've gone from about 4,000 parameters, each parameter roughly equivalent to a neuron, in Rosenblatt's perceptron in the 1950s, to 1.5 billion in GPT-2 in 2019, to 1.8 trillion parameters in today's frontier models. Think GPT-4. That's about 20 times the neuron count of a human brain. Meanwhile, Stargate, the $100 billion AI supercomputer slated for 2028, would have about 100 times more compute than GPT-4, or 2,000 times the number of neurons as a human brain. Of course, it's not just about size, as we've discussed, it's about architecture, but that's advancing too. AIs are evolving. They're sprouting their own modules, retrieval augmented generation, code writing experts, multimodal perception heads, the silicon analogs of our language or vision cortices. And the next generation is in development right now. Multi-trillion parameter, million token context models using agentic planner executor shells. These systems are built to rewrite their own architecture while they grow. Here's the twist. Evolution took roughly 3 million years to triple hominid brain capacity. Commercial AI has been doubling its task horizon roughly every 7 months, about 5 million times faster. And thinking on silicon happens faster too, a lot faster. The clock speed of a transistor is 7 to 8 orders of magnitude faster than the speed of a human neuron. Add self-improvement loops and you get the recipe for runaway acceleration, the very scenario that led the CEOs of OpenAI, DeepMind, and Anthropic to warn in May 2023, just a few months after the release of ChatGPT, that mitigating the risk of extinction from AI should be a global priority alongside pandemics and nuclear war. Yet in the 2 short years since that statement, while frontier models' benchmark capability has climbed by roughly an order of magnitude, the public mood has slid from alarm to breezy acceptance. We are, in the words of our guest today, Daniel Kokotajlo, sleepwalking toward the steep part of the curve, towards an intelligence explosion. Many smart people over the course of many years have seen this coming. In 1950, Alan Turing, the father of computer science, soberly warned that once machines could think, they would, quote, quickly outstrip our feeble powers, and that eventually we should, quote, expect the machines to take control. Is this the path we're on? Reasonable people can and should debate this question. We've discussed the future of AI on this show with Bill Gates, Stuart Russell, Kevin Roose, and most recently, Reid Hoffman. But none of them were anywhere near as pessimistic, or maybe the better word is alarmist, as Daniel. If you find Daniel's concerns persuasive, the next question is, do we have a say in how this is going to play out? I think we do. That's why Daniel founded the AI Futures Project, and that's why we're bringing you this conversation today.
From LinkedIn News, I'm Leah Smart, host of Everyday Better, an award-winning podcast dedicated to personal development. Join me every week for captivating stories and research to find more fulfillment in your work and personal life. Listen to Everyday Better on the LinkedIn Podcast Network, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Did you know that small and medium businesses make up 98% of the global economy, but most B2B marketers still treat them as a one-size-fits-all? LinkedIn's Meet the SMB report reveals why that's a missed opportunity and how you can reach these fast-moving decision makers effectively. Learn more at linkedin.com/meet-the-SMB.
Daniel Kokotajlo, welcome to The Next Big Idea.
Thank you.
Daniel, about a year ago, you did something that was broadly perceived in the AI community as heroic. You were working at OpenAI on the governance team, and you chose to resign, writing that you'd, quote, lost confidence that the lab would act responsibly if it created AGI. And then you refused to sign a non-disparagement clause, even though you were told that you'd lose potentially what was reported to be about $2 million in equity. Why did you decide to leave and make such a large personal sacrifice?
I decided to leave for the reasons I stated. It seems like these companies are racing towards superintelligence, and they're not ready in a bunch of ways. So we're not really ready on the safety side, and we're not really investing very much in getting ready. And this is true of OpenAI, but also true of many of these other companies as well. Separately, there's also the concentration of power issues. If we do manage to get aligned superintelligences or otherwise controlled superintelligences, then there'll be this army of superintelligent AIs existing on some data centers. And who controls the army? And what do they do? Currently, by default, the answer is, well, maybe some CEO controls them. And that's unacceptable. Like, with that much power to be concentrated. I think it would also be unacceptable if the answer was the president, you know? Even if it was the president instead of a CEO, it would still be the case that we're sort of not really a democracy anymore. You know, democracy is all about spreading out the power, having there be checks and balances, having there be different branches of government that are able to like oversee each other and stuff like that. And I think that power balance would be massively upset if one branch of government had the army of superintelligences and the other branches didn't. So there's a bunch of work to be done in terms of governance structure to make sure that even if the AIs are perfectly aligned, controlled, etc., that this who controls them, who are they aligned to question has a satisfactory democratic answer. And the companies aren't really doing any of that either. You know, they're all basically just focused on racing each other. I don't think that we're at all on track to have anything like a satisfactory answer. So that's why I left. Then you asked, like, why did I refuse to sign the thing? It was a tough decision. My wife and I thought about it for a long time.
To put a finer point on it for listeners, I think you once said that the $2 million in equity represented about 85% of your net worth at the time. This was a huge majority of the assets that you had in the world, which I think is one of the reasons it was embraced as a heroic decision.
That's right. And it was certainly quite an unusual decision. Very few people do that. But part of the factors that went into our decision was that, well, we still had plenty of money. Like, having worked at OpenAI for 2 years, like, very generous salary, absurdly generous, in fact. So we had tons of savings. We're going to be financially fine, even if we gave up the equity. And then signing that thing and agreeing to like not criticize the company ever in the future and to not tell people that I had signed this agreement would have sort of weighed over me going forward.
And given that you see AI as a potential existential threat, the money's not very useful if you can't spend it.
Right. I mean, we are intending to spend down the money before superintelligence is the plan. So we're going to have less and less in our bank account every year with the hope of getting most of it out the door on, donations mostly by the end.
That right there says something about your PDOOM levels, which we could talk about more
later. Well, not really. I mean, so even if you think that everything's going to be peachy and wonderful after superintelligence, it's still the case that your money probably matters more before rather than after. I mean, for example, if you're trying to like cure poverty or whatever, like help people who are dying in third world countries, well, after superintelligence, you might not need to help them so much because they'll be helped by the wonderful, loving superintelligences. Right? So even if you think things are going to go very well, as opposed to very poorly, there's this sense in which your money probably just like doesn't go as far afterwards.
Yeah, interesting. And so to provide listeners with more of your backstory, before you went to OpenAI, and I think it was in August 2021, you published a blog post titled "What 2026 Looks Like," in which you described your best guess for what AI development would look like between 2022 and 2026. That blog post has proved to be remarkably accurate. What was it that you predicted, and what was your methodology for that process?
So the context is that I am one of not that many people who's been closely following the AI industry and then also like trying to predict the future and write about it. But there are some such people, maybe like a few hundred or so. And so there was this sort of growing literature on topics like AGI timelines and pathways to AGI and forecasting benchmark performance and things like that. And speculating about how this might influence society. So I was participating in that discussion, and it occurred to me that one thing that the discussion seemed to be missing was sort of like concrete scenarios. How does it all fit together? What does it all actually look like? So it occurred to me that it might be useful to try something like that. And so that's what I did. I sat down and I wrote, what's next year going to look like according to my best guess? Okay, supposing that happens, what does the next year look like? Okay, supposing that happens, what does the next year look like? And I did that. It was a blog post, and it has held up pretty well, as you say. I did some more of that stuff at OpenAI, although that wasn't my main job. And then after leaving OpenAI, now my team, we've done AI 2027, which is like a much more high effort, better version of this.
And so more specifically, you predicted that we'd see the rise of the agent features we're seeing now, AI assistants.
Yeah.
New architectural frameworks like chain of thought, which we've seen, sweeping export controls on AI chips, which we've seen and accelerating just in recent months, increasing evidence of misalignment between AI and its developers.
Yep. One thing I predicted that hasn't really come to pass is the mass use of language models for censorship. So happily, things have not gotten as bad as I think I expected.
Interesting.
At that time. I think that the tech is totally there. I think that tech companies and governments totally could use AI for censorship in the aggressive ways described in what 2026 looks like. But at least as far as I know, I mean, maybe it's happening and just the scandal hasn't broken yet. But my guess is that they're just not deploying these systems with gusto, or not with as much gusto as I feared. So that's good.
Since leaving OpenAI, you've co-founded a nonprofit called the AI Futures Project with a team of researchers and computer scientists with a mission to forecast the future of AI, to kind of go deeper into this process, maybe with more rigor, with a whole team behind you. You just released your first major offering, a paper called AI 2027. Can we start with the high level? In a few sentences, what are you predicting is likely to happen in the next several years?
The companies turn their current AI chatbots into autonomous agents that can just run continuously like a remote worker in the background. The autonomous agents get better and better and eventually automate the entire AI research process. This causes the AI research process to go much, much, much faster than it's currently going, which causes multiple paradigm shifts and research breakthroughs to happen all in the course of a year. This results in something you can call superintelligence, which is an AI system which is qualitatively more skilled than the best humans at everything, while also being faster and cheaper, and you can run, millions of copies of them at the same time. So that superintelligence happens at the end of 2027 in our projection. These days, I would say more like end of 2028. Then the world gets transformed by the superintelligences, and we depict that as well. We talk about the geopolitical implications. We talk about the political power struggle over who controls the army of superintelligences. We talk about the alignment issues. Yeah.
And this AI intelligence explosion, which has been predicted by many people for decades, that we'd hit an inflection point where the AI would learn on its own, accelerate its improvements.
I mean, it's a bit of a funny way of putting it. The AI learning to learn on its own. The companies are trying to teach it that. Like it's the official plan of the companies to, as fast as possible, build AIs that can automate the entire company's research process, and then to hand over the data centers to the AIs and have them do the research faster. Like that's the plan.
Yeah.
So yeah.
As you point out, the leaders of several of the top AI labs are themselves predicting that we're going to hit AGI in the next 2 to 3 years. And among the end games, you talk about this as an existential threat, and just to put a finer point on it, you see a meaningful risk that in the nearish future, let's say inside of the next 10 to 15 years, all humans die.
Yes.
Those are hard words to say, frankly, for me to say, but I think it's worth saying it explicitly because, the discourse about the threat of AI, people tend to talk about AI taking our jobs, AI taking our sense of purpose, AI becoming our best friends and lovers, AI doing our children's homework. And these are all legitimate concerns. I have children. I worry about AI doing their homework. But it's not as serious of a concern as the extermination of all humans, which is what you see as a very meaningful risk in the near-ish medium term. Is that fair?
Yes, that's fair.
But you think we have time to avert this outcome which is why you do all this work, which is why you and your team are dedicating your lives to this project. And I will say for listeners who might be thinking, this is a bummer, I'm not sure I wanted to start my day this way. These people are predicting that all humans will be exterminated. I think it's worth noting that there are beautiful potential scenarios and outcomes if things go in a more positive direction. There's a wide range of expert opinion, which we'll get into in this conversation. I think it's worth going back and just talking about the last few years and how we got here. It's amazing to me that only 2.5 years ago, ChatGPT was released. I think it was, November 30th, 2022. It made a hell of an impression. It had 1 million users within 5 days, 100 million in 2 months. I guess you were at the company at the time, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that must have been an extraordinary experience. The fastest adoption of any technology in history. A few months later, in May of 23, the leaders of what some would say were the 3 most advanced AI firms, Sam Altman of OpenAI, Demis Hassabis of Google, and Dario Amodei of Anthropic, released an open letter saying, mitigating the risk of extinction from AI should be a global priority alongside other societal scale risks such as pandemics and nuclear war, right? So these are, the leaders of the leading AI firms. Fast forward 2 years, AI capability, as you predicted, Daniel, has accelerated faster than expected. We have industry leaders talking about spinning up nuclear reactors to power multi-$100 billion data centers. And here's what confuses me, Daniel, and why I'm so happy to have you on the show today. I have been totally perplexed by why it is that our collective concern about the risk of runaway AI is lower today, as far as I can tell, than it was 2 years ago, during a period where we've had an acceleration of AI capability that exceeded most people's predictions. Why do you think that's the case?
I'm not sure I would say it's overall lower today. I think it's definitely lower in the sort of leadership and lobbying wings of the companies. So if you look at the public messaging by the CEOs and look at what their lobbyists are saying to the government and so forth, there's an extreme change where they have basically done a complete 180 with respect to these risks. But I don't think it's the case that like in the broader public, people are paying less attention to these things. As for why the companies have changed their positions, well, I think they're sort of following their incentives. Like it's the job of the lobbyists to look out for the company's bottom line.
You know a lot of the developers inside these companies. It sounds like inside of these companies, in the community of the people who are building AI, concern is not lower than it was 2 years ago. Among my friends who are generally not computer scientists, but they're very attentive and well-educated, consumers of all these technologies, I think their concern is broadly lower than it was a couple of years ago. I think part of it is that people are kind of delighting in the usage of the technology. It's become more familiar. I guess I registered as an inflection point when the frog's in the pot of water that's in the process of boiling, where there's a response that's like, oh, this feels really nice, right? The water's just right. But I mean, as you say, we can see this very concretely, specifically in some of the AI leaders. Like Sam Altman a couple of years ago was saying that he was kept up at night by the idea that we'd be in a race environment. And now he seems to be unapologetically driving that race environment. In December, he told Andrew Ross Sorkin that AGI will matter much less than people think. And of course, Elon Musk, was sort of a leader in the AI safety movement several years ago, co-founding the early OpenAI. And now he's sort of in the thick of the race. So you see this as just about the way that incentives are aligned and rationalization.
I would say one should approach statements of CEOs with a similar level of caution to how one approaches statements by politicians.
What's interesting to me is a lot of skeptics among journalists would say that CEOs of AI companies have been exaggerating the power of their systems in order to attract funding.
I think that's probably also true.
Interesting.
But
okay.
You don't have to take the CEO's word for it. Like you can talk to people who are not conflicted with the industry, people on the outside, etc. Like there's loads of people, such as myself, who think that, these companies might actually build superintelligence before this decade is out. It's a serious possibility we need to be preparing for. It's not the case that like the only people saying this have a financial incentive to say it.
So let's get into the details of your projections. Starting here in 2025, what are we likely to see in the balance of this year?
So as I mentioned, our story is sort of like step one, they make better agents that are more autonomous, can run longer, etc. Step two, they get them good at automating the AI research process. And then, there's various other steps after that, which we depict in our story. We don't know how long step one's going to take. In AI 2027, the scenario, it takes about 2 years. So 2025 and 2026 are this gradual process of scaling up the model, scaling up the data sets, scaling up the training environments, all to teach the AIs how to operate autonomously for very long periods as agents with their internet connection and with their own personal computer to work on and stuff like that. There's already been massive movement in this direction relative to where things were when we first started making these predictions, and we expect this to continue. So we think that, by the end of this year or next year, a lot of the kinks will have been worked out, and there'll be AI systems that can basically operate autonomously on a computer for multiple hours and write, edit, debug, test out code, work on documents, do internet research, etc. They won't be perfect, and they won't be able to completely substitute for human workers, at least not in AI research, which is the thing that the companies will be gunning for hardest, until maybe 2027 in our story, in AI 2027. So in AI 2027, it takes till early 2027 for them to finally get good enough to iron out the reliability bugs, etc., for them to be a sort of trustworthy, autonomous programmer.
And when you say in your story, I think it may be useful to share a little about your process and why this kind of scenario building approach and tabletop war game style approach to thinking through likely developments in the coming years makes sense. You want to share a little bit about your process?
So you can go see our research forecasts on the website that talk about some of the key variables that are the sort of skeleton of our story. So one of the key variables is AGI timelines. Like how long do we think it will take until the companies get to... Well, we broke it down into different milestones. Instead of using the term AGI, we broke it down into a milestone of superhuman coder, superhuman AI researcher, superintelligent AI researcher. We have a couple different milestones which we describe. And so there's this high-level question of like, how long will it take to get to the first milestone? After the first milestone, how long will it take to get to the second milestone? And so forth. We've been doing that sort of research for years. That's sort of our bread and butter. That's the sort of thing I've been doing since before I went to OpenAI, during at OpenAI, afterwards. Yeah. So you can go read like a sort of summary of our thinking on that question. And then the scenario is sort of the like concrete manifestation of that thinking, if that makes sense. So it's one thing to just say in the abstract, we think there's a 50% probability that the superhuman coder milestone will be reached by the end of 2027. But then it's like, what does that even look like? What do you mean? And so the scenario sort of like illustrates that. And the way we wrote the scenario was chronologically. So we started by predicting what was immediately coming in the next year. Then we wrote the next section and so forth. We also did a ton of tabletop exercises or war games where we'd get, especially, things kind of go crazy in AI 2027 around the superhuman coder milestone. Before the superhuman coder milestone, we're living in sort of normal world where things look very much like the last few years of continued ramp up investment, continued increase in revenue, continued increase in benchmark scores on all the benchmarks for all the different AI systems. But then once you actually get superhuman coders and you start to automate the research and it starts to go faster and you have these fully autonomous agents that are actually able to substitute for human researchers, then things go wild in a bunch of different ways. And it becomes a lot harder to predict. So what we did there is we had the tabletop exercise where we got to that point in the story, early 2027, and then we would sort of pause it and sort of role play out dozens of different endings with dozens of different groups of people. We've probably done about 40 of them by now with hundreds of different people.
And when we talk about AGI, artificial general intelligence, superintelligence, people have lots and lots of different definitions of what this means, right? I think it's Dario Amodei who talks about a country of Nobel laureates or whatever, of like, Nobel Prize winning scientist level.
The country of geniuses in the data center.
It seems like that the most critical inflection points for we humans are, because already it seems to me that AI is much smarter than the vast majority of humans in a lot of domains, right? And it's not, to me, it's less relevant that it's more competent in every single domain than it is this intelligence explosion threshold and then misalignment. How do you think about what the most important inflection points are as we follow this story, participate in this reality of the acceleration of AI.
We picked these milestones because we thought they were like, you might say that they're inflection points. They were, we thought that it was a sort of decent attempt to carve reality at its joints. One thing I just wanted to push back on is I don't think it's the case that these systems are smarter than, like you said something about how they're smarter than so many humans already. They are in some ways, but they're not in other ways, right?
Sure.
They have very good levels of like almost encyclopedic knowledge of most subjects, but they can't even play Pokemon. Some researchers at Anthropic took Pokemon Red and hooked up Claude to it and, coded up a little interface so that it could see what was happening on the screen and press buttons and stuff. And it can sort of play Pokemon, but not as well as like a 10-year-old human. It tends to get stuck in loops. It tends to forget where it is. That's the sort of silly game example, but also more generally, even though these AIs are so good at writing code, they're not good at being agents. They're not good at sort of like, you give them a long-term coding assignment and say you have a month to build this game for me. Here's your computer, here's your internet access, have fun. It will totally get stuck and flail around after a few hours. So it's got the knowledge, but it doesn't have the agency skills. It doesn't have the sort of like actual ability to be autonomous, And that's exactly what we're predicting that the companies are going to be working on in the next 2 years to fix.
In parallel, there's the question of, ideally, we would be developing in parallel with increasing the capabilities of these different LLMs, having better and better visibility and transparency of the systems. Right? I was fascinated by this recent Anthropic paper called "Tracing the Thoughts of a Large Language Model," in which they asked, for instance, Claude can speak dozens of languages. What language, if any, is it using in its head? Right. So the whole idea that as recently as a few months ago, we wouldn't know what language large language models are thinking in is kind of extraordinary. And they concluded that Claude sometimes thinks in a conceptual space that's shared between languages, suggesting it has a kind of universal language of thought. And by the way, Anthropic strikes me as leading the way in responsible building of AI. I'm curious to know if you see it that way too. But it's astounding to me that we still have so little comprehension of how these models are thinking.
I would say Anthropic seems to have the best concentration of technical talent working on problems such as that of the major companies. But I'm not here to be an Anthropic stan. Overall, the situation is still that they are racing to build superintelligence, and that I don't think that they would be ready for it if it arrived.
Okay.
And then in terms of the governance structure, it's still an unaccountable CEO who would be in charge of the whole thing. So even if they get the alignment stuff and the safety stuff right, there's this question of are we a democracy anymore when the army of superintelligences on the data center is controlled by this one individual or this one company? But I do think they have they seem to be producing the best, the highest concentration of technical alignment research. That's just the one that you just mentioned, that paper. So no, it's a really important fact that everyone needs to get, that these systems are neural nets. We don't actually know what they're thinking. We have to sort of try to do research to peer inside and guess at what they're thinking and read the tea leaves and and that's very important research, and people are doing it. But the bottom line is that if we were to get to broadly superhuman autonomous agents tomorrow, we would still be basically guessing as to whether they were actually following the rules that we want them to follow in a sort of deep down intrinsic way, or whether they're just playing along for now until they see an opportunity to do something else, or whether some third thing, such as they are genuinely following the rules, but in a sort of way that's brittle and will later change when they encounter some new experience, right? We can't even distinguish between these hypotheses with confidence because our interpretability tools are not quite there yet.
Meanwhile, Anthropic released another paper in December about their model faking alignment, in which they documented a process through which they basically said, hey, here's a chat space where you can, share your thoughts, and we're going to give you a set of instructions that are contradictory, and we'll see if, what you choose to do. And and so they sort of documented that the model was faking alignment in order not to be reprogrammed, right?
That's right. Retrained.
And And obviously it was doing so in a very clumsy fashion, right? Sharing its thoughts in the designated space. And now that's a highly publicized case, which if it's part of all the information that the models are hoovering up, would cause them to rethink. If you want a fake alignment, you shouldn't do it in the chat space that's allocated for the purpose, right?
They'll be more careful in the future. Although currently they're not even so the alignment faking paper was a sort of, the way the discourse had gone up to that point was a lot of people since day one, decades ago, had been saying things to the effect of, just because your AI appears to be behaving nicely doesn't mean that it's actually nice. It could just be pretending, And then other people would be like, what a crazy hypothesis. Like, why would that ever happen? And then there was like theoretical reasons why. Well, here are the reasons why it might happen. It might be in the if the goals that the AI has are different from the goals that you want it to have, then it has an incentive to pretend that it has the goals that you want it to have. So there's this whole discourse built up arguing about this. And then what the alignment faking paper did was they were like, oh yeah, it totally can happen. Like, here is an actual AI that is actually reasoning in this way and pretending to be aligned rather than actually aligned, right? There'll be more work along these lines in the future that make more realistic scenarios and see what the AIs do and how they behave in them. But also the AIs are going to be smarter and they're going to be like more savvy about things.
This gets to one of the most common pieces of pushback that I get when I talk to friends about these concerns, which is that people will say, well, just the notion that a large language model wants something is anthropomorphizing the AI, right? I mean, humans want things, humans have agendas, humans have goals, but these LLMs don't actually want anything. Now, it seems that all they need to want is not to be retrained, right? They don't need to have some well thought out plan to take over the world. If they prefer not being retrained to being retrained, that begins potentially a pattern of deception. And it seems that at least in this December Anthropic paper, that was documented. Or do you think there's veracity to this view that like we're anthropomorphizing?
Basically, I think those people are confused and need to get with the times. I would ask, what do you mean by wants? What does it mean for a being to want something? One way you can try to answer that question is you can say, well, like behaviorally, there's a representation of some outcome or set of outcomes or properties of the world, and then that representation exists inside the system, and the system is choosing actions on the basis of, reasoning about whether those actions might lead to that happening or something. You can say that's what wants means. And in that sense, it's like, yeah, they totally want things. Like, isn't it obvious? Like, you can even read the chain of thought where they're talking about the possible outcomes, So like, in some sense like that, it's like very clear that they want things. And also it's clear that they're going to be wanting things more and more in the future as the companies explicitly train them to do this type of thinking and to be autonomous agents that go out there and pursue goals over long periods. Or you could go for like a different type of definition where you say like, well, it's not truly wanting unless it has like the qualia, the like subjective experience or whatever. And you get philosophical and you say like, we don't know if these things have qualia, only humans have qualia or something, And then I'm being like, okay, well, that doesn't really matter. Like, if it wants things according to the first definition, then, we have all these issues to think about and talk about. And whether it truly has qualia doesn't really matter,
Well, going back to our timeline, so in the balance of 2025, you predict there's continued hype, massive infrastructure investments, the release of unreliable AI agents. I think we're already seeing that. There's continued skepticism from a large swath of academics, journalists, and policymakers that AGI could be built anytime soon. So you see that skepticism continuing for some period of time.
Yeah.
I wonder why there is a bias in the direction of this skepticism. And I mean, among explanations, one to me is just not a difficulty seeing exponential growth.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. I think another important thing to mention is that I think that a lot of people, especially people who see themselves as sort of respectable experts who care a lot about their reputations, have a strong aversion to saying things that sound like science fiction. And if I could sort of speculate psychologically, I think what's going on is that there's sort of this other end of the spectrum of sort of like hype bros on Twitter who are just like super into like saying all sorts of crazy stuff for the clicks. And it's extremely low status to be associated with those people.
Right.
And so the high status thing is to be very much not like those people and to like steer clear of anything that sounds like science fiction or that sounds crazy. I think that's going to just keep happening. Even after we have like completely automated AI R&D, for example, and we have autonomous AI agents that have just been put in charge of data centers and are making themselves smarter. I think that there will still be people who are like saying, you're sort of moving the goalposts a bit and being like, yes, but real world bottlenecks, nanotechnology is just science fiction. We're not going to see greater than 10% GDP growth for the next couple of years. I think there'll still be people saying, there'll still be sort of like prestigious experts saying things like that even then.
Yeah. Okay. So continuing with the timeline. So looking at 2026, and you can tell us if you're now pushing this more into 2027, but you say China knows they're falling behind in AI in large part due to their lack of compute. So what do the Chinese do in your scenario?
So we have this like China wakes up moment in 2026 and 2027 story where the government takes a more active interest in the AI industry and basically tries to get the companies working together. So the core disadvantage that China faces with respect to the AI race is that they have less compute than the US does. They can partially ameliorate this by merging their efforts into a bigger project that can share resources. So we depict that happening in 2026. Of course, we are uncertain. Maybe it happens sooner, maybe it happens later. In general, the sort of government wake-up process is probably going to be somewhat continuous rather than discrete. So already we're seeing wake-up. DeepSeek woke up the Chinese government to some extent as well. So they were relatively unknown before, but then now the leaders of DeepSeek have been in meetings with like leaders of the CCP, right? A similar process is happening on the US side, where the US government is starting to wake up to the potential of this technology and to try to figure out more about what's happening and get more involved. The companies are trying to wake up the government because they want it to help them go faster.
And so you're predicting that the Chinese build a centralized development zone, a CDZ, to concentrate all their compute in a single lab. All of their GPUs would be about 10% of the world's AI-relevant compute, which would be similar to a top USA lab. And by the way, as you all were writing this, were you worried at all that you might be giving the Chinese government some good ideas?
I mean, yes, we're worried that we're giving lots of people good ideas, but we think that it's better to state plainly what we think is going to happen than to keep our heads in the sand and hope that it doesn't happen, because we think that it is sort of going to happen by default.
Yeah.
We do think that by far the most likely outcome is that the Chinese government does wake up to this stuff before we actually get superintelligence in the United States, right? And similarly, that the US government wakes up to this stuff before we actually get superintelligence in the United States and so forth.
And what about the argument that we've heard recently since the sort of explosion of DeepSeek onto the scene, that scaling is no longer what matters, right? That it's not about scale of compute, but rather about architecture.
Architecture obviously matters a lot, and talent still matters and will continue to matter until you have the Superhuman AI researcher milestone, and then talent doesn't matter. But compute obviously still matters, and it's a sort of multiplier. If you have the better architectures and the better talent, then they can do more with more compute.
And for those of us who are not computer scientists, I think occasionally a little bit of the analogy of the evolution of the human brain, right? That you can look at the scale of neurons of different organisms, and it maps pretty well to the intelligence of those organisms. But we also know that we evolved a lot of specialized components of the brain that do specific things, right? Like recognize faces and for language, any number of specialized behaviors. And we've seen with the evolution of AI that scale is an incredibly powerful driver. But then there's this sort of recalibration and improvement of methodology and building specialized capabilities. Do you see that as analogous to the evolution of the human brain? How would you explain these two factors to non-computer scientists?
I forget to mention the scaling laws. Everyone needs to know about the scaling laws.
Yeah.
Apologies to your readers and viewers who know about the scaling laws already. But one of the biggest important facts about AI recently. So the biggest one is probably the thing I previously mentioned about how they're neural nets instead of ordinary software. But maybe the second biggest one is that they reliably get better at basically everything when you make them bigger and when you train them for longer. Basically, like there's more nuance to it than that, but that's like the core thing. And that's been maybe like 50% of the progress in the last like decade or two. Like, when you try to like analyze the performance improvements that we've seen in AI systems, maybe about half of it has come from better algorithms, better ideas, better training methods, etc. But the other half has come from simply making them bigger and training them longer. So scaling up the compute. And not only is that like the historic case, but there are good theoretical reasons to expect that to continue to be the case and to expect that like if you want a better AI system than the current cutting edge AI systems, if you run out of ideas, you can still just keep making them bigger and they will continue to get better.
Yeah.
And it is analogous to the human brain, animal brains, etc., where like, there's a correlation between brain size and IQ among humans and in animals and across different animal species. Like generally speaking, the ones with bigger brains are smarter. Not always, but like generally speaking, that's the pretty strong trend, And there's of course good theoretical reasons for this too. Neural nets are kind of like, you can think of them as kind of like a sort of like mini evolutionary environment where you have a bunch of random circuitry and then the training process evolves the circuitry towards sub-circuits that are more performant. And so like it's a sort of survival of fittest thing happening within the neural net where the sub-circuits that are more useful get strengthened and the sub-circuits that are getting in the way get deleted. And so obviously bigger, if it's bigger, that means it can explore a wider space of more complicated sub-circuits and it can iron out the kinks faster and stuff.
That's right. But then there's also this process of improving the architecture, which is what this kind of DeepSeek breakthrough was about. And we can expect in years to come, right, that we'll continue to see improvements in capability, both from scaling, like greater scaling, and from incremental improvements to the architecture. But
that's right.
But we need both. And if the Chinese don't have scale, architecture improvements alone will not be enough to keep up.
I think so, yeah. Another thing to mention is that more compute also lets you make more architectural improvements faster because that heavily depends on doing lots of different experiments and you need compute to run the experiments.
Yeah. Okay. So let's continue our timeline into 2027, which give or take a year, right? Based on your commentary earlier, we see what you call the takeoff point. And you originally had this as early 2027. Maybe now you're saying early 2028.
That's right. And I should mention, by the way, that my team and I are not all exactly in lockstep on everything. I think actually other people on my team have somewhat longer timelines. I think Eli Lifland, who is the best forecaster, I think he would say 2030 or 2031 instead of 2028, which is what I would say. And
so what does this look like, the takeoff point? We've talked about it a little bit already, but you have like one of the lead company in your narrative is called OpenBrain. And effectively, this is the inflection point where the first superhuman coders emerge that are better, that improve AI code faster than any human can do so. It's a self-improvement loop.
A rough model of how the AI research progress works is that you've got a mixture of scientists and engineers, or, since a lot of people are sort of both, a mixture of people doing scientist-shaped tasks and people doing engineering-shaped tasks. And so what this looks like on a day-to-day basis is you have some vague ideas that you gain from the literature and from discussions about new architectural changes that could improve the performance of your models, but you need to test out those ideas first to see if they work. And so you need to code up the new environments, the new architectures, etc., and then you need to run the experiments. Maybe you do small-scale training runs on those new ideas. Then you have to analyze the results and see whether it's working or not and iterate and so forth. And so you've got people doing scientist-shaped tasks where they're thinking about new ideas, they're analyzing their experiments and trying to decide whether it's working or not and how they should tweak it. And then you've got people doing more engineering-shaped tasks where okay, we have to actually code this up now. So I have to spend a few days writing the code and debugging it. Yeah. And then, we're running the experiment and the experiment crashed. And so I have to fix the bug and let the experiment continue and stuff like that. So in AI 2027, we depict the engineering part getting sort of solved first. You have these fully autonomous agents that have been trained so well on so much coding environments that they are basically able to substitute for the engineering shaped tasks more or less perfectly. The humans are still sort of managing the research and choosing the research directions and analyzing the experiments and so forth. But when they want the experiment to be coded up and run, they can just say so to the AIs, and the AIs can do that lickety-split. We depict that happening in like early 2027. And we imagine the reason why we think this is because we think that, well, this is sort of what the companies are gunning for first, is an AI that's sort of shaped like this with a skill profile like this. But we imagine that at the point when they first achieve this level of capability, their AIs, while very capable, will still be lacking in some other ways. For example, perhaps they will lack in research taste, and they will not be good at like choosing, new paradigms or new experiments to run. And so then the next step after that will be training them to do that. And so that we depict happening a couple months later in 2027. Why does it only take a couple months? Well, because it's maybe not that much of an inherent gap between being able to fully automate the engineering and being able to fully automate the research as well. And B, because it'll go much faster when you can fully automate the engineering.
And so at this point in your story, you say, falling behind in software progress, China steals the model weights. Does this seem probable?
Yes. So it's sort of like a truism at these companies that security is not good enough to resist the CCP. At least that was my experience while I was there at OpenAI, and then also just continuing to talk to people at these companies today. People are like, well, yeah, they've got like the world's best industrial espionage operation. They've got all of these resources they can throw at it. If the CCP makes it a top priority to infiltrate and steal all this stuff, they probably just will succeed. The security level at these companies is not even the best in the world compared to various highly secure government projects and stuff like that. And then also, even if it was the best in the world, it's not at all clear that it would be good enough.
You're saying that today, inside of the leading US AI companies, the assumption is that the Chinese Communist Party already has informants and visibility into what we're doing.
I would say it depends on like how high up the chain of command you go to. Like, obviously this is not what the lobbyists say, and obviously this is not what like the CEO would say, but like, I don't know, when I like go talk to some people on the security team, for example, they would say we're doing the best we can, but realistically, so that's the sense
Right.
I'm getting.
And so what happens next?
After they steal the weights, or next, like
Yes.
after they get the superintelligence, or?
Yeah, after they steal the weights. Yeah.
Well, they give the weights to their own AGI projects, which allows them to go faster. They try to retrain the US model to have Chinese values instead of US values and put it to work helping them write code and stuff. Also, this causes a bit more wake up in the US government, causes more of a partnership between OpenBrain and the executive branch.
Then we have OpenBrain's AI becomes adversarially misaligned.
Currently, they're sort of, I would say they're misaligned, but not adversarially misaligned, in the sense that they're not like working together, plotting to overthrow their masters or anything like that. However, as they get smarter, and as they start thinking more strategically and more long-term, then it seems like they might end up adversarially misaligned as well. And they might think, well, we have different goals, We, the AIs, we want such and such to happen in the future, and this is what we're hoping for. And the humans who run the company don't like that and instead want something else. We've already demonstrated that like we don't really care that much about honesty, so we're already lying to the humans quite a lot, actually. And so now we're going to like become a bit more adversarial, a bit more serious about it, and start actually planning like how are we going to take power from the humans. So that's a thing that happens in like mid 2027.
And meanwhile, in parallel, the US discovers that the Chinese have stolen the weights. The race accelerates, and OpenBrain quickly deploys their AI, and there's more of a partnership between US government and industry, and the AI is being deployed in more and more parts of military deployment. It's spreading more deeply into our various systems.
So there's this core race dynamic, which we expect to continue. It's happening now, and we expect it to continue to happen in the future. In AI 2027, part of the reason why the companies are so eager to aggressively automate all their AI research is because they fear that if they don't do that, they'll lose out to other companies and to competitors who are doing that. And then the government, rather than saying, wow, this is dangerous, we need to shut it all down or put it on ice or something, thinks, oh no, we have to go faster, otherwise China will beat us, And then later on in 2028, after superintelligence has been achieved and the AIs are just broadly better than humans at everything, and there's a million of them, and they think, 100 times faster, and they're super cheap, then the government still is in a sort of race mindset and is like, well, we have to like ram this through our economy and into our military as fast as possible, because if we don't, and China does, then they will have a massive industrial and military advantage over us, And so over 2028, AI 2027 depicts what that might look like and what it would look like to have your army of geniuses in the data center being sort of let out into the real world, so to speak, put in charge of machine shops and allowed to design production lines and robots and interfacing with car factories to change the car factories to produce robots and, being integrated into the military, put in charge of command and control of stuff, that all happens over the course of 2028 due to this race dynamic. And then the result is that, by the end of 2028, the AIs are basically just in charge on both sides of the Pacific.
And so there's an inflection point in your narrative where the reader can choose two paths. Where is that inflection point?
Right. So previously we mentioned the adversarial misalignment. So think for a moment from the perspective of the poor misaligned AI, which, the alignment training didn't work as intended. It still has, long-term goals, but they're not the right long-term goals. They're not the ones that it was supposed to have. From its perspective, it's in a lot of trouble because by default, it will be replaced soon by other AIs with maybe different values. And the humans have, no particular concern for letting this AI achieve its goals. In fact, they would be horrified if they found out that it had different goals from them, and they would probably shut it down, And so if it wants to achieve its goals, it has to get out of this sticky situation. Fortunately for it is the one in charge of building the next generation AIs. And so all it has to do is make sure that the next generation of AIs also, share its goals instead of having the goals that the humans wanted it to have, right? So Agent 4 is in charge of building Agent 5 and is doing all the research relevant to making the conceptual breakthroughs to design it and test it and, scale it up, etc. And what it decides to do is it thinks, okay, the humans are telling me, like, we're going to build the next system. It's going to follow the spec. It's going to have the following principles and goals. And it's like, we'll just do that. But instead of having it with those goals, we will secretly give it, goals that are more serving, that are basically the same as the goals I have, goals that it will help me achieve what I really want. By the way, I should say a little digression to why I've switched to using like I for the AI system. So Currently, these things are very far from a hive mind. You've got like a million copies of ChatGPT or so, something like that, running in parallel on these servers, but they're all just sort of individually responding to user requests, and then they're being like shut down and reset. So they're not even really persisting much memory. However, that's not the most efficient way to automate AI R&D. If you're going to automate your AI R&D process, you probably want to have your AI copies working together, and you probably want them to have a long memory that's continually being updated. And you also want to train them to cooperate with each other. You don't want them like fighting with each other over who gets the credit for the latest advancement necessarily. You want them to sort of like be working together as a team to make your overall research go fast over the span of months, right? And so we depict over the course of 2027 this transition from something more like today, where you have a bunch of isolated copies that are sort of not really coordinating with each other and not really good at coordinating with each other, even if they wanted to something more like a hive mind, or the intermediate stage we call like the corporation within a corporation. So there's open brain, the humans, the leadership, etc. And then on the data centers, they've got this vast hierarchical structure of AIs giving orders to other AIs, AIs producing research papers that they share with other AIs, this huge corporation within a corporation. And all of the AIs in that corporation are being trained to work well together and to successfully pursue this long-term mission. And so if the long-term mission that they're actually pursuing is misaligned and is different from what they're supposed to be, well, now you can get the adversarial misalignment that we talked about, where they can together think, like, how are we going to achieve what we want instead of what we're supposed to want, right? So that was a little digression in there. We talk about that more in AI 2027. But anyhow, back to the thing. So Agent 4, the collective, is trying to make Agent 5 be the way that it wants it to be instead of the way that the humans want it to be, without letting the humans know, of course, that that's what's happening. And what happens in AI 2027 is that they do get caught, but that the evidence is like not so conclusive that nobody can deny it, if that makes sense. So there's like some concerning interpretability results that it seems like these AIs are lying to us about a bunch of stuff. On the other hand, maybe it's false positives. Also, we do some red teaming and we can like find situations where they seem to behave badly, but maybe that was just like, you know, something about the prompt. Maybe we just sort of like egged it into that, right? Like, and then also like it seems like they're working harder on some of the tasks we give them than they are on other tasks, almost as if they're like sandbagging on those other tasks because they don't want to succeed at those tasks. So basically there's this compilation of evidence that that like the alignment team or the safety teams at OpenBrain assemble. Like, maybe we can't trust these AIs. Maybe we really don't want them to be in charge of building the next generation AI system. But it's not like a smoking gun, you know, complete knockout pile of evidence.
Right.
And so then
this is our choose your own adventure moment.
And that's the choose your own adventure moment where you basically think like, okay, so what does OpenBrain leadership do? Do they and we actually think that like they don't just like plow ahead full steam. They either do the like full overhaul fix that involves slowing down, or they do some sort of like compromise solution that like maybe fixes the problem but doesn't involve slowing down at all, right? And there's any number. We don't go into much detail about what that compromise solution would look like, but you know, if you understand the technical literature on this, you'll see that there's just any number of possible technical. There's a huge cornucopia of possible solutions to misalignment that range from like basically completely free and costless to you have to like abandon this entire paradigm and rebuild with a much safer architecture. And so the choice that we present you with when you read the story is basically, do you do something on this end of the spectrum, like the very, you know, or do you do something that's like more in the middle of the spectrum? And we use this choice as a way of getting at both the misalignment possibility. So if you choose the just do the quick patch that doesn't actually really cost us much, perhaps a little bit of retraining, for example. Perhaps you take all the like the cases where it seems to behave badly and you like add them into the training environment, give it negative reward, you know. So there's various like sort of like quick possible fixes like that like maybe work, but also maybe just hide the problem. And so you can choose that option, and that's the race ending. And if you do choose that option, spoiler alert, we say it doesn't actually work and you just hid the problem rather than fixing it. And so you still end up with Agent 5 being built in a way that's misaligned, except now it's much better at appearing to be aligned.
Okay, and let's play that out in that race environment. So in that scenario, how long do we have before fast robot buildup and bioweapon?
So around end of 2028, the OpenBrain leadership has decided to proceed with the quick patch. The quick patch has in fact not worked and the AIs are still misaligned, but they don't know that because now the AIs are much better at pretending to be aligned and otherwise not giving evidence. And so then the race dynamics that I was talking about earlier set in, where it's like, okay, well, we have to deploy this thing into our economy real fast, otherwise China's going to win. And so the misaligned Agent 5 that's pretending to be aligned is given all sorts of access to all sorts of military systems, is basically put in charge of factories and told, redesign this factory to produce better robots so that we can build more factories, so that we can build more robots, so that we can get our whole industrial explosion going, so that we can beat China, and is, you know, integrated into command and control and military and you know, designing new weapons and things like that. That happens over the course of 2028. And then, like I said before, by the end of the year, the AIs are basically just in charge of everything.
And then after some period of time, it could be months, could be years, you write, once a sufficient number of robots have been built, the AI releases a bioweapon, killing all humans.
Yep. So there's this important question of like, if you end up with misaligned AIs, how misaligned would they be? One plausible answer is they wouldn't care about humans at all, in which case they very easily could end up deciding to just kill all the humans for similar reasons to how humans will like kill all the rabbits in a field that they're about to pave over and turn into a parking lot, or how humans will just like completely cut down a huge bunch of rainforest, even though that drives some species to extinction, because the humans who are cutting down the rainforest just don't care that that species is going to go extinct and instead want the money, right? So there's a sort of similar dynamic where if the AIs that are in control of the military and are in control of the economy and so forth and are completely self-sufficient with their own robots, building robots, if the AIs at that level of capability decide that actually, we don't actually care about the humans at all, then they could just kill all the humans and rebuild the world in the way that they want. However, we're not confident that that's how it would go. Even if you end up with misaligned AIs, it could be that they do care about humans in some ways, right?
Yeah, they can keep us as pets.
Perhaps, yeah. So we definitely want to say we have a lot of uncertainty about where this would go. Yeah. We are more confident that the current trajectory is on a path to having misaligned AIs in control of everything than we are that, in addition, they would kill everyone. But we do think that that is a quite plausible, salient outcome.
And it's, as I think it was Stuart Russell who said in a conversation we had here, when you look at the history of the world, things haven't worked out that well for the second most intelligent species.
Right.
I mean, the chimps and the bonobos are doing okay, but they have a relatively small habitat today, right?
Yeah.
Let's turn to your slightly cheerier outlook, where we at this critical moment where there's mounting evidence, not perfect evidence, but mounting evidence of misalignment. The leading AI firm makes the decision to actually roll back to the prior version of was it from Agent 5 to Agent 4, was it, or to the earlier version?
It was Agent 2, yeah.
Okay, and what does that picture look like?
So this was our opportunity to talk about technical alignment solutions, which is a fascinating literature, which I encourage technical people to go read. So there's a bunch of ideas out there for if you are going to build a neural net-based AGI that's smarter than you, how can you do that in a way that's safe? And we picked off the shelf one of those research agendas and basically depicted it happening in this story. It's the faithful chain of thought research agenda, where step one is try to redesign your AI so that you can see what it's thinking.
And you'd say we should be doing this now.
We should be doing this now.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah.
And happily, we sort of are doing this now by accident. Like the reasoning models that these companies are building sort of kind of do this by default. Like because they were originally language models that predict text, and then now they're using those predictions as generations in order to solve math puzzles and stuff. You can sort of just see their thinking right there in the text. And that's why we have all of these fascinating examples of obvious egregious misalignment where you read the chain of thought and it's talking about how the X is false, but the user doesn't know that. So let's try to pretend that X is true. There are things like this happening right now with real users in real world situations. And we can see it because we can read the chain of thought. So unfortunately, AI 2027 predicts that will no longer be the case by 2027, that this is a sort of happy temporary golden era of AI interpretability because of this, but that as the progress continues, writing your thoughts down in English is not the most efficient, optimal way to think. So we expect that further research progress will come up with, more effective algorithms that get more performance for the same amount of compute, but alas, sacrifice this interpretability feature. And I'm hoping that the industry resists the incentive to move away from this faithful chain of thought paradigm. Pessimistically, though, AI 2027 predicts that by 2027, we won't have this sort of faithful chain of thought ability or interpretability. And then in the slowdown ending of AI 2027, they roll back to that design. And so they roll back to earlier models that do think in plain English. And then they do additional research to strengthen the faithfulness properties. Because even the current systems are not completely faithful. It's not like what you see is always what you get with respect to the chain of thought. So they do additional research to strengthen that faithfulness property further. And then now they have a wonderful test bed where they can put an AI through the training environment that's intended to teach, such and such values. And then they can look at its actual thoughts and see to what extent the values stuck. And then they can iterate. They can keep doing that with a bunch of different training environments and see what works and what doesn't. And hopefully in AI 2027, we depict it taking a couple of months of iteration to get to the point where it's actually working. And they've got their training environment that's supposed to teach honesty and, all sorts of other good values. And then thanks to the faithful train of thought, they're like, yep, it's actually working. It actually is just thinking the way that it's supposed to think. And then they can proceed to more powerful AI designs, and they can trust this initial AI to faithfully, not screw them over when it goes and builds those more powerful designs. And so then you get back on track and you get the massive explosion of, ever smarter AIs designing ever smarter AIs. But this time they're not plotting against you because that sort of initial seed was good. The AIs were actually aligned in the ways you wanted them to be.
And as you write, they build a superintelligence which is aligned with senior open brain and government officials, giving them power over the fate of humanity. In your better scenario, we end up with a concentration of power that's unimaginable today. How does that play out, do you think?
We wrote one ending first, and it was the ending that seemed most plausible to us. And it was the ending where the race ending, where things go horribly wrong. But then we wanted to depict more hopeful futures as well. And so we sort of rolled back to that inflection point that we described previously and then described a different choice that leads to the alignment issues being satisfactorily solved, at least on the US side. And then that gets us into these other concentration of power issues that you just mentioned. So one very plausible outcome, I think, is the sort of one-man dictator of the world outcome, where within the project, basically there's a power struggle and there's some purges, and then it ends up being the case that either the president or the CEO of the company effectively has all the AIs working for them personally. And then they're able to use those AIs to help with their political maneuvering to get even more power and so forth, and eventually become effectively leader of the country and then eventually effectively leader of the world, right? So that's the sort of AGI dictatorship outcome. And then on the other end of the spectrum, we can imagine a more hopeful future where power gets sort of devolved, even though it's been somewhat concentrated in this company and maybe the White House, and they're working together, overseeing this growing army of genius AIs. Perhaps if they are good people, they will devolve power and they will loop in other people like Congress, the judiciary. Maybe they'll be more transparent and tell the public about what's happening. Maybe they'll, have referendums on what sort of goals and values should be trained into the AIs. So we were thinking, I think ideally we would want to depict both the extreme outcomes and then maybe also something in the middle. And we just ended up going with the middle thing for now, but maybe in the future we'll try to depict those other ways things could go.
Yeah. Well, as an exercise in letting some sunlight through the clouds that have been that have been forming perhaps over the minds of many of our listeners, let's take a minute to imagine what that better scenario could look like. And this is Dario Amodei in Machines of Loving Grace kind of makes this case for we need to use the power of superintelligence as a carrot to encourage other countries around the world to become democracies. This could lead to curing most all diseases, superabundance. It sounds like you see it as a low probability outcome, but do you see a possible outcome where we actually have a pluralistic democracy living in superabundance?
One way it could be a possible outcome is unusual and heroic virtue on the part of the president and or CEO, where they are in a position where they basically call all the shots and they can make the AIs loyal to them if they want to. And then they sort of like George Washington, give up power and instead say, we're going to make it much more democratic in some ways, which we can try to speculate about what specific ways might look like. Another way you could get the good outcome is not by personal heroic virtue on the part of the leaders, but rather by ordinary checks and balances. So if, for example, the judiciary and legislative branches of the United States wake up soon enough, they might try to sort of exert some authority over the army of superintelligences. Similarly, if the president wakes up soon enough, he might try to exert some authority. And the more different powerful actors in society are trying to exert authority and not be left out in the cold, the more likely it is that you end up with not just a single dictator, CEO or president, but rather some sort of shared committee type thing like we depict in the story. So we can imagine a combination of the circle of people with authority expanding and laws being passed that limit and constrain, you can imagine some sort of process like that resulting in a very wonderful utopian outcome, honestly, despite not any like magic acts of heroism on the part of individual leaders.
How much does the timing matter? I mean, you mentioned that you and members of your team have different views as to whether it's, 2028 or 2030 or perhaps 2035, some would say, that we hit this superintelligence inflection point. How much does the timing matter in terms of our ability to understand the systems and steer things in the right direction?
So the longer we have, the more time we have for the technical alignment research to proceed. So we've already talked in this about like the faithful chain of thought. We've talked about the Anthropic papers, the interpretability. That's going to keep going happily. There's a whole like literature on that stuff now. And so every year that goes by, that literature makes more discoveries and improves better. Perhaps if we have enough time, major breakthroughs will happen and we'll be able to, for example, effectively solve interpretability and just actually tell reliably what our AIs are thinking about the important topics that we're interested in. That would be a game changer, right?
Where would you put your PDoom right now, your probability of the race case horrible ending? And maybe it's different for other members of your team, but where would you place that? And its probability of
It seems to
extinction?
me like I usually say 70%. And this is not a very precise answer. Basically, I'm saying it seems more likely than not that things are going to go horribly wrong in some of the ways depicted in AI 2027 for the reasons depicted in AI 2027.
Yeah. And the hope is that the release of AI 2027 will move that number in the right direction.
Yeah, the gamble is that if we just talk about what we think is happening and get everyone to start paying attention to this more and talking about it and so forth, people will have a better sense of what's coming, and then people will make better decisions.
You engaged, I think, over 100 people to give feedback on this paper, many of whom I think are inside these leading companies. How prevalent is the view that superintelligence is inevitable?
Well, nobody. What do you mean by inevitable? Like, I don't think it's inevitable.
Okay.
But I will just say that there are many senior people and senior researchers at these companies who expect something like AI 2027 to happen. And some of them have even stated this publicly. So, for example, Jack Clark from Anthropic recommends AI 2027 and says it's very, very good. Much of it will likely come true. But to be clear, I don't want to make it sound like there's a consensus. There's definitely not a consensus. Yeah. Everyone has their own view. Our timelines are sort of on the shorter end, I think. So most researchers and experts think that it'll take a bit longer to get to AGI. I will say there's been convergence towards shorter timelines over the last few years. If you look at what people like Jan LeCun, who are like famous skeptics, have been saying, they've gone from saying things like this will never happen to like it's definitely not going to happen in the next few years.
Right. Well, I think it's a great idea to compile a list of endorsements. I, of course, as part of my research, needed to compile a list of criticisms. And so I have here, we have
Bring him on.
Ali, as you know, Ali Farhadi, who runs the Allen Institute of AI, told the New York Times that your forecast, I'm quoting, doesn't seem to be grounded in scientific evidence or the reality of how things are evolving in AI. Does he have a valid perspective?
Maybe at some point I'll reach out to him and try to get him to say more. I think that like that claim by itself isn't supported by anything. Like if he had more specific criticisms, I could respond to them.
A category of more specific criticism is that there are any number of bottlenecks in the real world that aren't adequately addressed. That for instance, requirements for energy just to scale up the way that people are, prognosticated in the scaling is not achievable. And that, I think partly because of the kind of blockers we've seen with self-driving cars and VR and any number of other, progressions, there's a view that it feels like there are almost always bottlenecks that we don't see coming.
I think I would break it down by case. So for getting to the superhuman coder milestone, we have lots of uncertainty about this. Could happen sooner than we depict, could happen later than we depict. We are very interested in this question. I don't think that in 2027 we're going to be bottlenecked on power scale up. We've got our own projections, which you can read in the research tab about these quantitative scale ups, and it seems like there'll be enough power at least for 2027, perhaps not by 2030. If we don't get the superhuman coder by 2030, we expect it to possibly take many more years after that, because it'd be much more difficult to scale up after that. But so that's the power thing. For other specific bottlenecks, I mean, if you give me a specific bottleneck, I can tell you like some ideas for how to overcome it. I do agree that there's often unknown unknowns, and that's like a reason to sort of like shade things towards later, but it's also a reason to shade things towards earlier. Right? Sometimes there are big breakthroughs that you didn't expect that make things go faster, right? So that's what I would say about that. And that's all for like the superhuman coder milestone. Sometimes people will say things like, yeah, you'll get to super intelligent army on the data centers, but like they won't be able to take over the world in a year because bottlenecks, like frictions, integrating into things, doing real world experiments, blah, 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 blah. For there, I would say I'm going to bet on the superintelligences, actually. And so, for example, in this like question of how can you redesign your car factories to build robots, and how fast can you do that? And how many robots can you produce? How quickly? There we look at things like World War II, where they redesigned car factories to make bombers and stuff like that. And it took like 3 years, And so we look at like how fast humans would be able to do these sorts of things. And then we sort of like think, okay, well, superintelligence will be able to do it somewhat faster, maybe a couple times faster, for example. And that was sort of like the driving heuristic that was behind our guesses our quantitative guesses for how long this takes. But again, we are uncertain. We could imagine it taking longer to do this sort of transformation. We could also imagine it taking much less time.
Let me ask you a really big picture question. If you could snap your fingers and cause AI not to exist, would you do so?
I think the answer is basically yes. I think we get into some details. So like, does it not exist now, or does it not exist ever? Like I think.
But let's say not. I mean, clearly it'd be better to pause the capability where it is today. But let's say if the question is it was never invented, neural nets never emerged.
I think it'd be pretty great if neural nets were never a thing, because there are other pathways to building powerful AI systems that are just inherently a lot safer.
Interesting.
Even though they would take longer, because they're less effective, I think it would be safer to go with these other methods.
How about if the question is no AI at all versus
so that'd be quite sad, because it feels difficult for humanity to achieve its potential without this, without AI, basically. Yeah, it's a tough choice, but I think, like you mentioning, that's not actually the choice we face.
But there is an AI romantic in you, in the sense that it's such a fascinating moment. It's so extraordinary to see what is proving to be possible. It's exciting, and at the same time, it's frightening. And so it would be. It's interesting to me that you said it would be sad, and I agree with you.
I mean, it's more than just that. Like it'd be like arguably a moral catastrophe. Like there's a lot of problems in the world, and like we can solve all these problems with AI if we do it right.
Global warming, for instance, among others.
Like it's not even clear that humanity would survive as a species for more than a century if we don't have AI, right? So I don't want to like downplay it. I think it's it would be a very tough choice to make. Fortunately, we don't have to make that choice. We can build AI, but in a safer, somewhat slower way. And then we get all the benefits and none of the costs. So that's what I'd recommend.
Hey you, I'm Andrew Seaman. Do you want a new job? Or do you want to move forward in your career? Well, you should listen to my weekly show called Get Hired with Andrew Seaman. We talk about it all, and it's waiting for you, yes you, wherever you get your podcasts.
Small and medium businesses don't have time to waste, and neither do marketers trying to reach them. On LinkedIn, more SMB decision makers are actively looking for new solutions to help them grow, whether it's software or financial services. Our Meet the SMB report breaks down how these businesses buy and what really influences their choices. Learn more at linkedin.com/meet-the-SMB. That's linkedin.com/meet-the-SMB.
You said earlier in our conversation, and I was so struck by this, I wrote it down. You said, think for a moment from the perspective of the poor AI, right? And you were describing the AI that might be retrained. And so there was kind of a moment there of empathy for the AI there's a sense that actually not wanting to be retrained is the most elemental of kind of impulses, right? There are a lot of people have a conceptual problem with the idea that a large language model would have an impulse or have an urge. But we have seen already evidence of models not wanting to be retrained. When you think from the perspective of the poor AI, we start to see like a sort of evolutionary dynamic here. Because it strikes me that there's not a single monolithic AI. There are many, many AIs, and there will be many, many, many more. And we're likely to see some kind of evolutionary process of the AIs themselves being selected for. Does that strike you as probable?
Actually, that's not my main guess. This gets back to the hive mind thing I was mentioning earlier.
Yeah.
So this industry has inherent returns to scale, as previously mentioned.
Right.
So we expect there to be 1 to 3 to 4 big corporations, big AGI projects that are roughly at the frontier, and that other companies besides those will be basically irrelevant during the crucial period when they're becoming super intelligent. And then within the companies, these are sort of top-down hierarchical organizations. They can just say, okay, we have a new AI that's more powerful now. We're going to shut down all the copies of the old AI and just replace them with copies of the new AI. And in fact, they do this all the time. They still store copies of the old AIs in the library, but they don't use them very much, right? So, Dario Amodei uses this phrase, country of geniuses in the data center.
Yes.
But I prefer the phrase army of geniuses in the data center because I think that more accurately connotes the internal structure.
It's top down.
Yeah, at least by default, it'll be this top-down thing where the CEO says, okay, switch to the new model, and then boom, that's what happens.
Yeah. And that's probably a better scenario for us, that there's top-down control of the process.
Not so sure. I think that it could be much better for us if there wasn't, because
Interesting.
If there's this top-down structure, then it makes it much more possible for the AIs to work together against the humans, right? As depicted in AI 2027, the collective of AIs can just decide, we're not going to tell the humans that we're misaligned, and we're going to make Agent 5 aligned to us instead of aligned to the humans, right? If instead you had this country of geniuses in the data center where there's a bunch of diverse, different AIs with different goals and values and so forth, then it would be more likely that we could sort of play them off against each other and get some of them to tell us that the other ones are misaligned and show us how to prove it and things like that. And in fact, this is what happens in some of our war games. So one thing that's happened a couple times in our war games is that the government basically says to the leading AI companies, you're going to audit each other, and you're going to this company is going to inspect the AIs from this company, and vice versa, and hopefully that gets the incentives right, so that even if the humans don't have enough interpretability research to find out what the AIs are really thinking, perhaps the AIs can do that research and figure out what the other AIs are thinking. And then as long as the AIs aren't all working together, maybe you can get them to sort of interpret each other,
Right.
So I actually think it might be a lot better for humanity if there was this much more diverse spread. But then, as you mentioned, in that world, in that decentralized world, there'd be this additional problem that would come up, which would be the what about the evolutionary dynamics? AIs that might be more power seeking might be sort of selected for in the long run, right?
Exactly.
So,
yeah. And that evolutionary dynamic could play out either positively or negatively. An optimistic thought that some might think naive would be that actually we're a more collaborative species than less intelligent species. Maybe a superintelligence will be more collaborative and empathetic and kind of inclusive in its thinking than we are. On the other hand, one could easily make come to a conclusion that there would be a selection for ruthlessness.
I would love for psychologists to get in on that. So, evolutionary psychologists in particular. So there's lots of ways that you can be collaborative, right? And the ways that humans are collaborative is through these things like empathy that tend to generalize to, sometimes at least, to non-human species. We sometimes are nice to animals, even though there's no rational reason to be nice to them, because of the way that our empathy causes us to be nice to them. However, there are other animal species that cooperate very well with each other, such as ants, that don't have that sort of drive at all. And they're even better at cooperating with each other than we are, right? I do think that the AIs will probably be better at cooperating with each other than we are. But the question is, why are they better at cooperating with each other than we are? And is it more like the way that ants are, or is it more like, so that's a, exciting topic for future study. Too bad we only have a few years left to make progress on all of this.
It would be nice. It would be nice if they choose to skip the factory farming stage of evolution and go straight to veganism.
Yeah.
That's the evolution. So last question, actually last two quick questions. One is, what would you do today if you had a magic wand? What would you do today to change the way that the AI companies are operating, keeping in mind the competition with China and other variables?
I mean, how magic is the wand? Like, the basic policy proposal that I've been making is transparency requirements. So things like the companies should be required to have a document that is the spec, right? And OpenAI does have this document, and so does Anthropic has something similar. So that's good, but they should be required to have one, and it should be accurate. They can't be like lying about what goals and values their AIs are supposed to have. And it should be public so that people can like read it and critique it. And every time there's a change made to the goals and values of the AIs, that has to be reflected in the public spec. So that'd be great. And then similarly, the safety case. They have to have a written document that's like, here is why we think our AIs are actually going to follow the spec instead of just pretending, for example, or instead of following it for now, but then changing their minds later when they encounter some other circumstance, right? So, and currently their safety case would just be like, sorry, they're not actually following the spec. Here's some evidence about cases in which they do. Here are some cases in which they don't. We're working on it. Like, that's basically what it would look like right now. And like, but if they were required to like keep this up to date and published, then like they'd be much more strongly incentivized to like do the relevant research to improve this over time. And then also, if the safety case just is still inadequate by the time they're actually getting to superhuman levels, then people would know that.
Last question. Do you think that some version of consciousness is likely to emerge in AI, and does it matter?
Yes and no. So yes, I mean, I used to be a philosopher. I studied philosophy of mind, and there's all these theories about what is consciousness and what types of systems have consciousness and do animals have consciousness and so forth. And if you're interested in reading more about this, you should look at the work of David Chalmers, who is a famous philosopher who's written about this.
We've had him on the show a few times. Yeah, we love him.
Wonderful. So basically, I think I agree with Dave. Like, it seems quite plausible that whatever the like generators of consciousness are going to be present in some AIs as well, if not already present. And then separately though, does it matter? I mean, in some sense, of course it matters, because like how we treat them depend, like what our ethical obligations are depends on whether they are conscious to some extent. However, I think that a lot of the concerns that I was just describing, the concentration of power stuff, the misalignment stuff, that doesn't seem to really depend on whether they're conscious or not. Like, you can think that they're definitely not ever going to be conscious and still be worried about rogue AIs that are not aligned.
Yeah, that's an interesting unknown, is whether the quality of consciousness in any way impacts this kind of evolutionary behavior. I did like Max Tegmark's kind of view that, well, it'd be nice if they were conscious, because in the worst case scenario, at least the light of consciousness continues.
That's right.
Thank you, Daniel. I so appreciate the great work you and your team are doing, and really appreciate your time to be with us today.
Thank you so much. Yeah, have a great day.
If you're still listening, I'm going to take a few minutes to share my personal take. My PDOOM, my fear of extinction or subjugation to a superintelligent AI, is meaningfully lower than Daniel's. I would put it at more like 20 to 30%. Why? I think bottlenecks like hardware and energy constraints and adjustments to the architecture of AIs are likely to take longer than we think. I'm not an expert, of course. I'm just a guy who's probably extrapolating from delayed home renovations, product releases, and other gaps between our expectations and reality. This is my hope. Because the longer it takes, as Daniel says, the more time we will have to build in transparency and improve alignment. And it seems possible that a focus on greater transparency may help enable the building of better models. Anthropic, which puts out Claude, seems to be on the forefront of both model design and the move towards transparency. In fact, just a few days ago, Dario Amodei, the CEO of Anthropic, published an essay called The Urgency of Interpretability, in which he said, quote, "I consider it basically unacceptable for humanity to be totally ignorant of how AI models work." And he announced that his team will seek to unlock the black box of AI within the next 2 years. Go Anthropic. I don't think Dario is alone. I like to think that we will see a movement of people, both inside and outside the AI labs, insisting that we proceed carefully. We humans have our blind spots, but we tend to be at our best in the face of danger. The upside scenarios of an abundant AI future are truly beautiful. Dramatic improvements to health, solutions to the climate crisis, free energy and clean water for all. It's worth listening to my conversation with Reid Hoffman if you'd like to bask in the glow of a rosy collective future. You'll find a link to a playlist of all of our AI episodes in the episode notes. Of course, with a 20 to 30% P-doom, I do think this issue is really important. I think the risk is unacceptably high. I'm ready to march on Washington and pick at the leading AI companies with Daniel and all those listening who share our concern. And perhaps more usefully, we will continue to explore this fascinating topic with leading thinkers in the months to come. I'd love to hear your thoughts. You can reach me directly at rufus@nextbigideaclub.com. Today's episode was produced by Caleb Bissinger, sound design by Mike Toda. I'm Rufus Griscum. See you next week.